Good evening. We are back again after last night's Marath John Steele Santa Maria Glee's What the Heck Happened show that went for an astonishing 2 hours. We are back to talk about another slightly controversial event, that of the Operation Dynamo Dieppe landing. This is the second of eventually we're going to do 3 shows about this. The first was David O'Keefe, our guest, talking about how the whole concept came up and the real reason. The third one, so skipping ahead, will be either live from Dieppe or with footage from Dieppe where we run through the events of August 1942. But today, the middle show, we're going to talk about the plan and how the plan was meant to go. And joining me, so he's a bit of a World War II TV regular now, which is good, is David O'Keefe from Canada. Hello, David. How are you?
Hi, Woody. How are you?
I'm very well. So we're going to talk about Dieppe. So you have a PowerPoint presentation to share with everybody this evening, and we will go through it there. And it's kind of an easier show for me because David's done this numerous times. And we're going to talk about it. So we will just, I think for the first 5 minutes, let's just recap what we said and what we established in the first show, just in case any of these people watching tonight have not seen that first show. So just 5 minutes about the origins of the real reasons for the raid.
Okay, well, I mean, number one, we're talking about one of the most controversial episodes of the Second World War, a mystery that's lasted for so many decades when it comes to the intent behind the operation. And of course, what we talked about last time was that very difficult historiographical narrative that has developed over the years, which has essentially led nowhere. And then, of course, what I brought to the table was new research over about a 15 to 20, well, actually almost a 25-year period now, which has completely changed our understanding. In other words, taken something that seemed to have been a caboose on the operation, as a matter of fact, an aspect of the operation that nobody knew about. And then at first it seemed like it was caboose. And as you will see today, it definitely became the locomotive. In other words, that the operation was part of a larger pinch policy and a series of pinch operations that combined operations along with Naval Intelligence Division had been putting on for over a year, about 18 months at this point, all with the idea of supporting the efforts of the code breakers at Bletchley Park. So there you go, all that in a nutshell.
Well, if we'd done that in the first show, we'd have been home having beer much quicker. Why did we do it over an hour? That was that was a very good introduction there, David. So yeah, it's all about Enigma. It's all about code breaking. It's all about the problem that we are having in the North Atlantic with the Germans and U-boats and submarines and naval power, and basically they concealed this within this large-scale, full-blown, not divisional size, but nearly divisional size attack, blah, blah, blah. So let's run through. I will hand over to you in your PowerPoint presentation, and let's run through it. And then when I feel I have a question either from myself or some of the people watching, we will interrupt. So let's go. So there we are.
Okay, there we go. I mean, first of all, I think what we have to do is, one thing that we forgot perhaps is the Pinch Doctrine. I mentioned it very quickly. And the idea was, remember, and one of the reasons why I felt comfortable, several years ago, coming out and shooting my mouth off and saying, this is what Dieppe was all about, was simply because of the discovery of this, that there was actually a policy in place that was developing over the period of 1940, 41, and into 42, where the British were developing what they would call a pinch doctrine, the idea of how do you get in, capture the material that you need to speed up the process of cryptography or cryptanalysis, and how do you get away with it? So what you see in front of you now are the elements. The elements of this pinch doctrine are based on surprise. As a matter of fact, as I've argued before, it's even to the point of putting the slider further over towards surprise than you ever would in any normal operation. So in other words, not only with Dieppe, but all the other operations, they are predicated on the utmost attention to surprise. I mean, that basically becomes the underpinning. One of the reasons for this is because they know in pinch operations, it's all a race against time. Once the enemy is contacted, then depending on the situation that unfolds, if the enemy feels that they are going to be overtaken, they will then go into their standard operating procedures of destroying any type of material, whether it be signals or not, that is supposed to be destroyed rather than having it fall into enemy hands. So this is what the British realized, that this is really, as soon as first contact is had, you've got the race against time. The clock starts ticking. So you have to close with your enemy quickly. You can't give him a way of getting away from you, and you need to close time and space in a fast manner so you can get what you're coming after before they have a chance to destroy it. Now, part of that, of course, was coming in with that typical thunderclap of surprise. And the idea was that you didn't necessarily need overwhelming fire support, destructive in nature, but rather suppressive in nature. So in other words, you need just enough to be able to rattle, panic, or kill the crews, but not too much to the point where you completely destroy everything. So we're talking about a real mixture here, a very fine run or near run kind of battle. The other thing too that is very important is not only do you have an infiltration plan to get to your target, but more importantly, an exfiltration to get the material when you capture it out and back to England as fast as possible. Then, of course, comes covering it up. The idea that you're going to use a destruction operation or destruction plan, or you are going to work sort of hand in glove with the newspaper correspondents, although they have no clue why you're asking them to do this. But they are going to report, for instance, say on a ship that you captured, they are going to intentionally report that it was sunk. In other words, to cover up. The other thing that they noticed was in the Lofoten Islands, earlier raids, the idea was that you need to destroy almost anything and everything in your wake as you leave to reduce the amount of suspicion in the minds of the Germans. Eliminate is impossible, but what you want to do is reduce it. So in other words, from a very bureaucratic perspective, unless the Germans have 150% proof that the material that you have has been captured, and they understand how Bletchley Park works and how important it is, and the mind of people like Alan Turing, they're going to see this generally as temporary and not permanent. So there is a risk that you're running, without a doubt, but it's all calculated. The other thing too is, and everything you see here comes from the documents, particularly the bottom. Heavy casualties are or can be incurred if the targets are considered to be A1 targets. So basically anything to do with signals intelligence is considered to be A1. Now, I've always said this in connection with Dieppe. I do not think that taking 907 deaths and roughly 4,000 casualties in just under 6 hours was really what they meant when they said taking heavy casualties. But what it did do is it gave the force commanders on that day a bit more confidence to push the envelope and go for gold, if you will. Okay?
Yeah. And just to jump in here,
yeah.
I think, as students of history, we look at Dieppe very much from the army point of view, because we think of those commando units and army units on the beaches. This is naval. It's about naval intelligence is the key to this. This is about winning the Battle of the Atlantic and other things as well. So I think that's important. I also want to make the point, and I'll let it go back to you, that the way we have been using, I'm going to use the word commando forces up to about 1942, has not really been forgetting things. It's for going in and blowing things up, isn't it? We're not necessarily, that's something we've got to evolve and learn how to do. You look at the LRDG and the SAS, they're very good at blowing up airfields, but they haven't been good at stealing stuff and getting stuff back. That's a completely different use of special forces that's being adapted for this. Now, there's a couple of points I wanted to make, just because they interest me as I'm going along. But yeah, no, we mustn't think of Dieppe as just being about an army. It's an all services operation that's part of a much greater global effort to win the war, and that's where the whole Battle of the Atlantic. And for those, we did it in the first show, David's book, you have to go through a lot of stuff before you actually start getting to the Dieppe raid, and you're reading it thinking, is this necessary? And I mean that in a complimentary way. Then when you get it, you go, yes, I realize absolutely why we had to go down and thoroughly explore that avenue and thoroughly explore that bit, because now I'm armed with information to take forward into the Dieppe raid. So yeah, if you get the book and you look at how big it is, keep with it, stick at it, you do get your rewards later. It's like one of those big long Netflix series. You've got to go through the early episodes to get your to get your Mandalorian episode 8 season 2. Anyway, I
That's a good
digress.
way of
Back to
putting it.
you, David.
That's a good way of putting it. But no, I think you're absolutely right. The sense is we've always looked at this from the Army or the air component. And it seems that for 7 decades, the whole naval imperative has just gone completely under the radar. No pun intended. And you realize, and that's what I realized through the research, that this was really the imperative that was driving it. This had nothing to do with the second front in the sense that we thought. It had nothing to do with popularity or publicity at this time. It had everything to do with trying to tip the scales at a very sensitive time. As a matter of fact, in 1942, it's kind of like the world we're living in right now. The United States has come into the war, right, in 1941, and it's kind of like the vaccine. The vaccine's on the horizon. Eventually, we're going to beat this thing. But we still have to get through this year. We have to get the vaccines out. And that is pretty
Top
much...
analogy, David. I like that. That's good. Best analogy on a show for a long time. Well done. Yes.
Well, thank you. Historians every once in a while can be au courant, you see. So basically that's where it is right now. And this would be the summer of 1942, where things are not necessarily going as well as they had hoped by this time. So as a result, there is this incredible urgency to be able to break the four-rotor crisis. And so the developing Pinch Doctrine, which is paid dividends, very good dividends, with pinching into the three-rotor enigma, now is being tasked with going after the four-rotor. And of course, as I mentioned before, the A list of targets would be anything to do with the naval enigma, whether it be three-rotor or four-rotor. So basically cipher sheets, you can take anything from lids, wheels, scraps of paper, and I mean anything. The pinch units were taught to basically bag up everything. It was kind of like being at a crime scene. In other words, you have no clue what evidence is truly going to be evidence, so you bag everything up. The other thing too is a lot of people don't realize that one of the ways that Bletchley was dealing with the four-rotor issue was to try to break into the back door using cribs. And to do that, you had to be able to break into lower level codes and ciphers so you could understand what the plain text was and then match it up with the enigma. So to do that, you could capture other types of material, which were all prevalent in Dieppe as well. So you have the backup hand cipher. So a lot of people don't realize the Enigma machine used to break down on a regular basis. And so they used to have a backup code book called the RHV. This was really important. The other thing too, you have short signals like weather codes, E-bars, B-bars. You have the Kriegsmarine General cipher and the dockyard cipher, the Werftschlüssel. There you go. That was something that was also quite interesting because you can get the comings and goings and the sort of the day-to-day administrative operational messages if you capture that. And then that then can be married up. And it's kind of like breaking into a crossword, where sometimes if you get one or two words going across, you get clues into the next. Well, that's the basic concept that they're looking at. So in Dieppe, the British have been tracking the traffic that goes on throughout the entire English Channel. So 2nd Defense Division, which is the German division, that is responsible for everywhere between Boulogne and Cherbourg. They have been monitoring all that traffic for 2 years. So they understand the patterns, they understand the ebb and the flow, and generally speaking, who's going to be where, when it comes to coastal convoys, etc. So by this time, naval intelligence has done a workup where these are the types of vessels, as you can see here on the left, that they're expecting to find. As a matter of fact, what you have in front of you is from the operational orders. And what they've done is they have given a coded and gridded reference with code words for the types of vessels, because they want an inventory quickly. In other words, those who are standing offshore, or perhaps even Mountbatten back in England in his command center, they want to know what's on display in the harbor. In other words, they want to know what kind of material they can expect. So they have code words, for instance, for E-boats, R-boats, minesweepers, barges, trawlers, etc. So it gives you an idea right here of the kind of ships that they are expecting to find. The top three definitely carry the latest in Enigma, and the others could, depending on the availability, the distribution, etc., but they would all carry everything that I just showed you on the previous page. So right now you're looking at a very target-rich environment for pinch purposes. And you can see here, this is a photo that was taken, I believe it was before the raid by the Germans themselves. And Main Beach is off to the left. This is the channel, the English channel's over here. Main Beach is here. This is the outer harbor, as they call it. This is Pullet Cliff. And what I call the gauntlet is that inner channel that connects the English Channel with the outer harbor. These essentially are the kind of vessels, the smaller ones, as you can see down here, are in kind of the crook of the outer harbor. And then the larger ones down in the background, like torpedo ships, the E-boats, the R-boats, etc., the minesweepers. Here, this actually is a still from a film that the Germans shot on the afternoon of the raid. As a matter of fact, this came from one of their propaganda films, which is interesting. And it shows you that on that day, whether it be in the morning or certainly in the vicinity of Dieppe, you would see that the harbor is lined with the kind of targets that they were looking for, including some of the bigger minesweepers, torpedo boats, etc. All right. And so that's it right there. And you can see how close this is. And this is key because remember, I told you when we talked about Pinch Doctrine a few minutes ago, the idea was closing with your enemy quickly. And one of the most controversial aspects, or two of the most controversial aspects of the entire operation, was the frontal assault. In other words, why do you come in over Main Beach? And why was there no heavy bombing? And as you can see right here, the targets that they were after were located in this area. These are all the ships in the harbor. There's also another supply base right around here, supply facility. But what they were also targeting was this building right here, which housed what they suspected was naval headquarters. And in there, they were expecting to find supplies set for distribution, not only to these ships, but all the other ships in the channel, because Dieppe was a supply base for naval communications as well. So the key was that you could see coming over Main Beach, you are taking the shortest and most direct route to your target, without a doubt. And it may sound simple like that, but the plan, as you will see in a couple of minutes, was anything but simple. And there is the Hotel Moderne. By the way, if you guys are there when all this lifts and we're allowed back out in the streets, and hopefully the next time we do this, we will actually be able to take you guys on a virtual tour. This is Les Arcades Hotel, which they suspected, naval intelligence suspected, was the Hotel Moderne, which was being used as naval headquarters. In reality, their alternate target, which they suspected was about, well, I think they figured it was about a 30% chance, was actually correct. This is the Hotel Moderne, or this was the Hotel Moderne circa World War II. I believe it was still the Hotel Moderne until the early 70s. I don't know what it is now. I think it's a combination of condos and a shop down below. No longer a restaurant and a hotel like it used to have, but this is what they were after. This is essentially what the pot of gold was, or the contents that was held within. At least that's what they suspected. Now, I should always tell you, remember, as a historian, kind of like intelligence, it's what they suspect is there. I've never had any confirmation whatsoever, except that that this was the actual location. But certainly in the files, this is what they're going for. And I know at the end, there is a security unit, German security unit in this part of the harbor that is in the process, or actually does, dispose of 6 bags filled with coding and cipher material into the harbor. So even though I've never been able to make the official, the official verdict that indeed this was German naval headquarters, that is of secondary importance for the historian, because this is what naval intelligence believed on that day was their pot of gold. They must have got close, and there could have been there because, like I said, there was a security unit in the harbor that did grab material from this area and destroy it in the harbor. So there seems to be something there. Okay. Do you have any questions, or maybe we could take a question or two from the
there's nothing coming in. I think they're just fascinated right now. But I wanted to confirm as well that, or reconfirm that it is when I can't now remember when I first heard about the Dieppe pinch raid theory, but it was a year or half ago or something. And it was all about what they're just going after one Enigma machine in one building. It was the revelation, I think, that there was these multiple. It was a target-rich environment. It was ships, it was offices, it was supply. That was one of the moments that for me kind of tripped me over into being a bit skeptical. To what, this guy's onto something. It's there's a lot of potential there. It's not, they're not putting their eggs in one basket. It's high risk, but there's a few bites of the cherry available to them.
You're absolutely right, and I think what sold me, on this was the contingencies that are built into this, which is something we never realized. And I'm happy you brought that up, because there are layers, as you're going to see in a couple of minutes, in the planning that shows you just how important it was. And also, too, you are spreading your net wide. I mean, one of the reasons why you alluded to them earlier, the Army commandos, who come in on the flanks when Operation Rudder turns into Operation Rudder 2 and then Jubilee, they are veterans of pinch operations in the Lofoten Islands. So, these aren't just Army commandos, as you said before, coming in to muck about and destroy things. They also are looking for material on the flanks as well. Yeah. So it's not simply about getting commandos into the harbor, although that is without a doubt the main purpose, but also spreading that pinch net wide, or as wide as humanly possible, given what you're dealing with. They're hell-bent on coming away with something, at the end of the day. And it really, for the most part, except for the naval boys, they don't really care who comes away with it, as long as they come away with something. Well, just to get back to the planning, March 13th is when they make the discovery that the four-rotor is in the channel. It is not operational on surface ships in the channel, but without a doubt, it has been distributed and is being distributed to all the ships in the channel area. So that's when Bletchley and Naval Intelligence realize it, and that's when the planning for Dieppe starts. There is no confirmation, no evidence in January of 42, despite Hughes Hallett, who was the Naval Force commander and lead planner, who mentioned something in his memoirs about them sitting down in January. There is no intelligence collection, no planning, nothing until the discovery of the four-rotor. And then everything goes into overdrive. By April 8th, there is an outline plan, okay, that is put down, sent to the chiefs of staff. First of all, it's agreed upon by Mountbatten Combined Operations. Then it's sent to the chiefs of staff, who look it over and essentially rubber stamp it. But it's an outline. The only thing that's in the outline at that time is the role of the HMS Locust and the Royal Marine Commandos. Everything else is to be determined and added. And of course, at first, without understanding what they're after, without understanding Pinch Doctrine, without understanding what eventually we would understand about their role, it doesn't really make sense. As a matter of fact, I think, I mentioned there was another historian who just simply said it looked like it was something that was dreamed up by a staff officer who had little, if anything else to do. And of course, without a doubt, it certainly looks like that until you understand how the planning came down. Okay, hang on a second. Somehow I'm getting subtitles. Okay. Okay, so eventually it goes through there. At the same time, there is the creation of what would be the 30th Assault Unit. The 30th specifically to take part in this operation, although the official creation would not come till after Dieppe. They knew that they were going to carve a platoon out of the Royal Marine Commandos who were tasked with the pinch in the outline plan to basically provide a naval intelligence assault unit. Up to this point, all the pinches that had been carried out by ad hoc pinch units raised from either the naval complements from a ship that were then whose task it was to escort an expert in naval intelligence who knew about Bletchley, who was far too important to lose, into action. This was something that they felt was too risky, but at the same time, they wanted naval intelligence wanted to control their own commando unit to be able to go after the kind of material they were going after. And that is one of the reasons why Ian Fleming ends up getting involved in all of this, because he is the one who has been tasked, as one of many of his portfolios, as we discussed last time, with developing Pinch Doctrine. And so he is the one who then creates this idea, based on the German idea, by the way, of using an intelligence commando or creating an intelligence commando that is going to accompany or is going to be the central focus of various raids and operations going in. So he proposes this immediately. It takes about 4 or 5 months for, and this is where things can be a bit controversial, for it to officially be accepted as part of the order of battle. But starting in March, at the same time that they're planning for Dieppe, they are already on the books unofficially with naval intelligence. In other words, they don't have the full, what they're trying to do is create a unit that is going to be then bought and paid for and put on the order of battle. But right now, they have a job that needs to be done. So they are going to raise or carve out a platoon and then specifically train them. The idea is to give them enough information so they'll be able to get what they're looking for. So basically what we've already discussed, but keep them in the dark as to what the significance of all this is. And so that's what they wanted. They wanted much more control than entrusting these very sensitive pinch operations to just basically a boarding party from a crew of a destroyer or a frigate or something along those lines. They wanted specialists.
Yeah, and I think just to jump in here, because we'll do a show on 30AU at some point, I think it'd be fascinating to talk about, is I hate when I see them listed as just in a list of commando units, because it's like, no, you've got to make the distinction that there's blowing things up commando units and there's this kind of unit. And it's, I've had Damien Lewis on shows, he talks at great length about that 41, 42 period of the old boys network and these renegades and pirates, he refers to them as in his early commandos. And 30AU are anything but that. They are much more surgical in how they've been established and created. I think means they shouldn't be talked about in the same kind of way as number 4 command, number 1 command. I'm hoping you agree with me on that.
Yeah, I do to a certain degree, but there is an element of privateering, more than piracy, if you will. I mean, some people would assume that's synonymous, but there is a privateering aspect to this. In other words, that even this force that is created for Dieppe, and I don't mean about the ones that you see in front of you right now, but the task force that is going to go in after this is called the Cutting Out Force. And the Cutting Out Force is an old term that is used in privateering operations. So without a doubt they are. But yes, they are not all about mayhem, if you will. In other words, you're right. There's much more of a surgical aspect, much more of what I would argue we see special operations as of today. And you would even argue that perhaps this is the origins of modern special operations and special operations units. Because remember, this is not just getting in, as you said before, mucking about, destroying things and running away. They have an infiltration plan, an exfiltration plan, and it's all bound up in something that is extremely sophisticated. Now, before we go on, I should tell you that this is the cadre of X platoon, number 10 platoon or X platoon, which was carved out of the 365 strong Royal Marine A Commando. This was very much experimental for the Dieppe operation. And, it gets me. I just take a look at the faces. They're essentially all between 18 and 21 years of age. I think the oldest one may have been Krutoffer at 26. He was the old man. And, I'm a professor. I've been teaching for many years. And, essentially, this is my college class.
Mm.
And that's something that never, you can never really forget. You really, it really hits you hard, the human aspect behind it. And of course, for those of you who have seen Dieppe Uncovered, the documentary, this is Paul McGraw. Paul Mac McGraw was the Royal Marine Commando that we interviewed and the last surviving member of this unit. And he sadly passed away in 2016. But of course, one of the big reasons when I found out about this unit, I thought, well, of all the units within the Royal Marine Commando, why did you choose this one? And the conclusion that I came to was because of this man right here, their commander, 21-year-old Lieutenant Herbert Oliver Huntington Whiteley. Now, if the name sounds familiar in the current day, what would have been his great niece is Rosie Huntington Whiteley, the Victoria's Secret supermodel, who is, I believe, either the wife or the girlfriend of Jason Statham, the action star. So that kind of connects us with, with the modern world, if you will. But I had to figure out why. What was it about him? Well, when you look into his lineage, you realize that if you cut him in half, he would bleed the colors of the Union Jack. I don't think you can get anybody more British than Huntington Whiteley. His grandfather, well, his grandparents on his mother's side, basically two of them were heads of the Royal Academy of Arts. Another one was Rudyard Kipling, part of the clan.
You're just name dropping now.
Oh yeah, now I'm not. Yeah, but it's important here, and then very important. But more importantly, his grandfather was Stanley Baldwin, the prime minister, the former prime minister of Great Britain. There's also a connection somewhere between his father and Ian Fleming's father as well. So he was known. He was establishment. He was trusted, which is very, very typical of British intelligence at that particular time. He was tough by all accounts. He was exacting. He was extremely proper. As a matter of fact, Paul McGraw relates a story about one of the commandos who on the morning when they got off Dieppe, of course, they never used the name Dieppe. They said, he basically said, where the fuck are we? When all the fire was coming in, and Huntington Whiteley just turned to him and said, well, I guess I can tell you now, we're off the shores of Dieppe, and I will see you in my office in the morning. In other words, he was that kind of character, right? He was extremely proper, but boy, did they love him, without a doubt. And of course, the sad irony is he, despite the fact that he survives the Dieppe raid, he's killed just outside of Dieppe in Le Havre in 1944, just shy of his 24th or 25th birthday. This is one of the earliest maps from the Dieppe planning. And the only thing that you can see on here, and even though they knew about all different headquarters, is actually the Hotel Moderne as a target right here. This is where you're seeing it right down here. So that goes to its centrality. All right, but the key to getting across, or the key to getting or pulling off the pinch raid, and this is where we get close here, is surprise. Is how do you get a raiding force of 250 ships, albeit small ones? How do you get them across the English Channel, through a minefield, and then to appear offshore right at a particular time just before dawn so you can spring upon your enemy? Well, as you can imagine, I would argue that one of the greatest successes of Dieppe is the ability to do this. The coordination that was pulled off by combined operations when it came to its naval component was absolutely incredible. And they actually did it. Originally, for Operation Rudder, they were going to leave from one or two ports until the Germans, with their reconnaissance aircraft, discovered that there was a concentration in these ports and launched a raid. They decided for Operation Jubilee, when it went in August, to start from about half a dozen or more ports, and then they were going to sail down, and then they were going to group out and move through the minefield in mid-channel together. In many cases, it's kind of like a World War I trench raid, where you're not going to mass all your forces in one sector of the line. They're going to creep out into no man's land and then move together and then across through the barbed wire, and then boom, they're going to surprise the opposing trench. In many cases, that's what you're looking at here, a trench raid, an amphibious trench raid. So the idea was that they have to get across. And as part of that force that is crossing, you have another heavy hitter. The head of the cutting out force is Red Ryder, who is the newly minted VC recipient from the Saint Nazaire raid. And of course, he would go on to head 30th Assault Unit at the end after the Dieppe operation. He was known for his guts, for his daring, and above all, by this time, his battle experience. So you are truly bringing in your top talent for this operation. This is not a publicity stunt, despite what even Red Ryder says at the end of the war. Of course, for security purposes, he had to. None of the principals lived long enough for Ultra to be revealed. So if you take a look at their memoirs, if you take a look at their reports, it's all heavily sanitized for security purposes, fully understandable. He called his role nothing more than a publicity stunt, which is interesting because it wasn't, and there was nothing like that. And it was the same thing with Saint Nazaire, where just before the Saint Nazaire forces were about to hit, they stumbled across a couple of French and Spanish trawlers, which they proceeded to capture because they wanted to pinch material off that as well. Well, so you have the commander of the strike force, the Royal Marine Strike Force, or I should say the cutting out force, which contains the Royal Marines. But it's interesting because not only do you have two battle groups of Royal Marines, but they are riding, one battle group is riding on the back of a river gunboat, the HMS Locust, which has been in the mix right from the start. And the HMS Locust, and I'm not sure if I've got a picture here, but it's up here on the right. Flat bottom gunboat. The idea was that, you'd be able to navigate the channel. And also too, it packed a wallop. It had some serious firepower up front and on both sides. And also the Royal Marines took to retrofitting their 3-inch mortars to the top to provide extra firepower. Not to mention that the strike force called Tiger Force, which was on top on the deck, was told to train its Bren guns and its Tommy guns and their rifles, and basically let loose as they were coming down the inner channel. And you'll see why. But basically, the Locust turns out to be, as I've said before, a pissed off porcupine. In other words, it is armed to the teeth and ready for this. And it's amazing because this really does, in many ways, rival Saint Nazaire. And when you sit back and you think about Saint Nazaire, I mean, you're probably listening to this and going, well, Dieppe sounds like it's pretty much boys' own kind of attitude and amateur enthusiasts who are planning it. And without a doubt, it is. But it's the same thing with Saint Nazaire. In other words, the concept is take an old British destroyer or an American destroyer, make it look like a German, pack it filled with explosives in its bow, put it on a time fuse, put commandos on its deck and following along in smaller ships, and ram it into the dry dock at Saint Nazaire. Meanwhile, the commandos jump off, hit various targets, and then their exfiltration plan is to run to Spain. I mean, my God. I mean, this is, when you take a look at Saint Nazaire, which we consider to be the greatest raid of all, and then you take a look at the plan for Dieppe, you can see the development in the sophistication. Doesn't mean it's a better plan, but it definitely means.
I think just to jump in, that the amount of effort put into the exfiltration, I think, is important because you've got Operation, which is the one in to go and get the heavy water into Telemark. What's the operation? Freshman.
Yes.
and their escape plan was cycle to Sweden in the winter of and as you say, Saint Nazaire, just walk to Spain, and Cockleshell Heroes again. If you get caught, just run for it. The amount of effort put into to getting back is, I think, key to the fact that we need to come back with stuff. This is nothing to do with blowing shit up again. I'm going to use that crude way of describing it. We've got to put more effort into getting this stuff back as we have getting in there. I think that's key.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, you certainly see that. I mean, one of the things that you always look for in a plan to give the indication of where the center of gravity was is to take a look at the contingencies, or as the British call it, the branches and sequels. And that's what you see right here. And so that was something that I realized when I was going through the research, that just how many contingencies were built into the pinch. So this was not just a question of throwing 30 men from, number 10 platoon in, not at all. You have cooperation, direct cooperation with 2 battalions. So you have the Essex Scottish and the Royal Regiment of Canada, and you'll see it all on the map, how it all unfolds or supposed to unfold. The tanks, 1 squadron of the Calgary tanks with another one in reserve and another one working around the flank. You also have the engineer combat teams, which are landing on the main beach, which are responsible for blowing roadblocks in the town to allow the tanks in, because the tanks are going to be your mobile firepower in the port.
And just to interrupt you, we had a question earlier, which I was going to save for the right time, about the Churchills used on the beach, saying, I'll just go back to the message there. I can't find it now.
Would it be something to do about getting off the beach and their tracks?
No, it was what? Why did we use the latest model Churchill if this is if this is just a cover? If the frontal attack is covering getting the equipment, why use our best tanks?
Well, it's not a cover. You're doing it because you need the frontal assault is what gets you to your target. So in other words, and I have no clue whether this is the reason why they chose the latest tank to do this, but certainly the Churchill is built as an infantry support tank as opposed to, for tank combat. So in this particular case, and you'll see this on the map in a few minutes, when I explain the branches and the sequels, the idea is that the tanks are to get through the tiny streets of the town with the cooperation of the infantry and the engineers and into the harbor, because it's the tanks in the harbor that are going to provide the mobile fire support in addition to the Royal Marines. Because as this unfolds, it's not just the Royal Marines who are tasked with the pinch. You also have the Essex Scottish that are told that if they get into the harbor before the Royal Marines, as they expect to do, they are to take out the crews of the various ships that are in the harbor with the help of the tanks. You need that mobile firepower from the tanks, and that's in the operational orders. Which is fascinating because nobody was really sure why the hell they would have tanks to start with. And then until you understand the importance of taking what is off the trawlers and what is off all the other ships in the harbor, you don't really understand the primal importance or the primary importance of having tanks land where they do and come through, because they're the ones that provide, or in theory, are supposed to provide the overwhelming fire support to kill or panic or subdue.
And I think again, just to jump in, it's key that they're needed beyond the beach. If it was all just about the beach and damaging some stuff and going back home, we could have maybe used different types of armored vehicles that didn't need to move anywhere. The very fact, as you say, they're infantry vehicles, infantry support tanks to get inland, it supports your argument, not goes against it. I think.
Well, you see it in the operational orders. The operational orders are very simple and straightforward. They have a code word called trawlers, not very sophisticated, but the idea was that you're supposed to get in. And, perhaps let me jump ahead because maybe it's a little bit better if we see how it all unfolds.
Yeah, we're already 45 minutes in. I mean, I'm loving it.
Perfect.
I mean, I feel we're going to be at this all night if we're not. I mean, I'm loving it, and people are watching it, so that's good. But yeah.
Okay, so what you're seeing on the map in front of you is essentially the area that we call the gauntlet, and that is this inner channel right here. This is the main English Channel over here. You have Red Beach here, White Beach up here. The Hotel Moderne is in this area. All the trawlers are here. This is Pollock Cliff, and this is the Harbor Mole, and then of course you're approaching, and then the channel into the inner port. So this is the backdrop of what we're going to be talking about now. And these are the photographs that were shot before the operation went in. And you can see the Pullet Cliff and the famous church. I think it's Notre Dame de Beausecours, if I'm not mistaken, that controls access. So entrance and exit from the harbor. You need to get this without a doubt, because the Germans not only have guns on top and behind, but they've also burrowed out cliffs, caves into the cliff at the base. And so this becomes very important, because as the operation unfolds, the idea is to set up a cordon and basically two shoulders of a funnel to get the locust in, and then to get the information that they've captured out. And so it requires cooperation of the Essex Scottish, the tanks, the Royal Regiment of Canada that's coming across, the engineers, and then of course not only the Battle Group Tiger Force, which is on the Locust, but a second backup task force with Royal Marines called Robert's Force, which was led by Titch Houghton. And so as a result, they are standing behind the Locust, about 20 minutes behind, with another gunboat by the name of Arlesford and some French chasseurs that are supposed to then bring in the extra. So there is contingency after contingency after contingency. And you can see the kind of what they would be up against. I think this is an incredible photograph. I mean, you talk about air reconnaissance pilots doing their job. Look at this. I mean, this is somebody. Yeah, it is. It really is outstanding. And the same. I mean,
you couldn't get better if you were stood there with a camera over your shoulder, could you? I mean,
that's the remarkable part, isn't it? I mean, this is the kind of attention to detail that they were putting into this. You know, and this actually was something that was taken on the day of, and you can see the fighting going down in the central part. And I know in the next edition that we're going to do, or the next show, we're going to talk about what actually happened on that day. But just to give you an example of the commanding view and the commanding terrain of the German position on Pullet Cliff, which is overlooking the entrance. And that's the channel, the harbor mole's over here. And then, of course, the idea was the Locust is supposed to come barreling down here, all guns blazing. Hopefully, the Essex Scottish command not only these buildings here with one company, but the rest of the harbor is lined by the other three companies of the Essex Scottish. So, what I'm going to show you now, and as you can see, I've poured millions of dollars into CGI just for this.
George Lucas will be proud there, yeah.
Yeah, well, there you go. There you go. And if George Lucas is watching, or Steven Spielberg, they can always feel free to reach out if they want to do the movie, and we can actually, you know, put something in that is truly state-of-the-art. But for what we're working on today, this will suffice. The idea is, and you can see here the map, there's the inner channel, the gauntlet, the main English channel over here. You have the beach, the promenade, and then you have the harbor. The idea was for the infantry and the tanks and the engineers to land on Main Beach and move as quickly as possible in the most direct fashion into the area that has the main targets. To do so, you would have to get the tanks through the streets, which had roadblocks. And that's what was so key with the engineers. The engineers, cooperating with the infantry, were to blow at least one, if not all, the roadblocks leading into the harbor to provide an entrance for the tanks to get in to provide the firepower. Because they were going to arrive likely before the Locust was to come in, they were given orders, the Essex Scottish were given orders then to seize any material they could get their hands on. First of all, to subdue all the German resistance with the aid of the tanks in the harbor, and then go on to the ships to capture the crew, to ensure, and tie their hands together, by the way. This is the origin of the infamous tie your hands order. Tie their hands specifically so they cannot destroy Signal's material. And then the idea was that they were searching, as you can see in their war diary, searching for a naval code book. So this was something that the Essex Scottish understood. And that's not surprising, because in June, there was a coordinating meeting specifically put on with all these elements to tie up the pinch, which is interesting. So right then you can see that this is not a caboose, that this is about getting the locomotive in. So the idea is that the tanks and the Essex Scottish are going to subdue German resistance. Now, this is not, they can see in the plan that there's a possibility that this may not work. And so there is a signal that is supposed to be sent, first by radio, and if radio doesn't work, then they're supposed to fire up flares. Green flares will indicate to Ryder, who's commander of the cutting out force, that that the Germans have been subdued, and it's going to be a cold reception. If they send up red flares, it means it's going to be a hot reception, that somehow they failed to reach to their target. There's still fighting going on. You will notice that there is no contingency for calling this off. This is not, green for go, red for stop. It's green for, for cold, and red for hot. Either way, if the Locust and the Arlesford and the rest of them can make it to the harbor mole and get into the harbor mole, then they will come barreling down the inner channel once, as you can see here, they will come down either with, no guns blazing or all guns blazing if necessary. And orders are given by Mountbatten that if any of the ships are sunk, the commandos on the decks are to swim to their targets and continue to fight. So, like I said, this takes on a boy's own attitude. I mean, we are talking about a true, it's stuff of Hollywood legend, if you will. And had they pulled this off, I don't think we'd probably ever be talking about Saint Nazaire in the way we do. Yeah,
it'd have been relegated to second on the list.
It probably would. Because you think about this. I mean, here you go. You've got the Locust coming in, all guns blazing. About 150 commandos on the deck, and then followed very quickly later by the Arlesford with a bunch of chasseurs, bringing another 175. And of course, for Titch Houghton's boys, they were told that if Tiger Force, the first force, fails, they're to pick up the slack and go after the targets. And so the idea was to disembark on the island and spread out, with all the commandos hitting different targets on the island, with the exception of number 10 platoon, our boys led by Huntington Whiteley, who would then make straight for German naval headquarters. Now, my understanding is they were packing not only their weapons, as you can imagine, and extra bandoliers of ammunition, but they also were packing fire extinguishers, which is interesting. In other words, they were, if they had to, they were going to try to extinguish whatever fires may have occurred. They have been set on purpose, etc. They were also carrying haversacks. Roughly about 15 haversacks, from my understanding, were empty ones, were being taken into naval headquarters. So whatever it was they were looking for, which obviously has anything and everything to do with the four rotor, they were expecting to find a gold mine, without a doubt. And even then, after they were to go, and if they had to, they would have fought, tooth to tooth, face to face, and all the way through. Basically, the idea was to get in, to subdue any resistance in the hotel, and then perform the detailed search. Now, what is interesting, there's a caveat in the detailed planning that gives orders to everyone in the operation, that nobody is allowed to search that hotel without contacting Huntington Whiteley first, which is interesting.
I think just to jump in again, these are key. The haversacks, the fire extinguisher, and the priority given to this, I think, are important things to underline here. There probably are still some people watching these streams, or maybe not now, but when they watch it later, who are still kind of arms folded. The pinch raid thing is bullshit, blah blah blah. At this point, you've got to concede, if you're watching this, that getting this stuff was definitely part. They may not be convinced yet it's the actual, as you say, it's the engine, not the caboose, but you cannot at this point deny that getting shit out of that building is key to this, because why on earth would you need fire extinguishers except for putting fire out for something you need to take back? There's no reason. We don't send in commandos with the ability to put out fires unless there's something we need from that fire. Yeah. It's simple, isn't it?
Well, that's it. I mean, they're there to capture material, and there's no doubt about it. But I mean, as we will see later on, I mean, the real key to understanding how this is the locomotive is really to take a look at the contingencies, look at the cover plan, look at the infiltration, exfiltration plans. And so, you know, this is where we are. We're now at the point where they have massive cooperation with various, almost half the entire raiding force is involved in this pinch operation. You know, whether it be the tanks, the engineers, the Essex Scottish, the Royal Regiment, the entire strike force of the Royal Marines. Plus, of course, you have Ham Roberts, who is the land force commander, who has the Fusilier Mont Royal at his disposal to throw in if he needs to support this, and another squadron of tanks. So these are all the cards that they have to play on that day. Nothing else in the operation comes close to this, not even when it comes to contingencies, force allocation, anything. There is nothing there that rivals this. So as a result, to get back, the idea is to rifle through German naval headquarters, grab whatever it is that they're after, stuff it into their haversacks, and then collect anything and everything that the Canadians, if they were successful, had managed to either capture or at least secure, scoop it all up. Now, the key is there is a code word that was being used. And when I read this in the archives, I started laughing for obvious reasons, knowing full well who was the author of this, which was, of course, was Ian Fleming. The code word that was supposed to be sent to signal not so much success, but to put into effect the exfiltration plan was called bullion. So in other words, gold bullion. So, I mean, it's, you know, when I read that, I laughed. I thought, oh my God, it's Goldfinger, you know, or something along those lines. I had to chuckle, to say the least. But the code word was bullion. And basically that meant that in the heat of battle, if anybody from the Royal Marines uses that code word, they are to be given priority exit from the harbor. But what they also did was, in addition to the capture, they decided they were going to send in a motor launch. And the motor launch would come in right in the middle of battle, specifically so the commandos then could load on the booty that they were able to capture, and that's the term they used at the time. And so the idea was they were going to load this on, perhaps with one or two of the Royal Marines, and then they were going to whisk it out of the harbor right in the middle of the battle and right back to the backup command ship, the HMS Fernie. On board the Fernie is Ian Fleming. And a lot of people have known that Ian Fleming was at the Dieppe raid, but they don't understand that he was also taking an active part in the Dieppe operation. Because in his report, his official report that he writes to Naval Intelligence, to Godfrey, his boss, who then sends it to Mountbatten, he mentions that he was waiting on board the Fernie with orders to grab the intelligence material and make a beeline straight back to England. So in other words, Fleming is actually off the coast working as the anchorman of the relay race to get everything home. Now, once the pinches happened, then of course the rest of the operation, if successful, continues to unfold, but really it's a scaled down operation that goes in. Originally, Operation Rudder, as it was called, was supposed to be 15 hours in length over 2 tides, but by the time they go in for various reasons, it's on 1 tide and it's about 6 hours. So it really is a hit and run, get out real quick. You don't have a lot of time to, you know, to go inland like you would suspect they would. So immediately what they do is then start to cover up what has gone down in the port by laying on a comprehensive destruction or demolition program. So pretty much anything and everything in Dieppe Harbor is supposed to be blown up, including naval headquarters and everything else. So it gives you that impression that they are indeed mucking about, as we've talked about, as they leave. And then, of course, the final coup de grace apparently was the fact that naval intelligence had discovered that somewhere here in Pollock Cliff, the Germans allegedly had a large storage facility for torpedoes. And they suspected that there was about 2,500 torpedoes stored somewhere in Pollock Cliff. And they had a Jeep specially rigged with explosives, and they were going to drive it in on a timed fuse and leave it there. And the idea was that when the raiding force was halfway across the English Channel on its way back, it was going to blow up. And essentially, it was going to take down all of Pollock Cliff, and perhaps I would argue even create a mini Halifax explosion, if you will. So, fortunately for the Dieppois, the people who live in Dieppe, that never happened. Sad to say. And of course, they never got to this, because what I've just shown you never came to fruition. And probably in the next episode, we're going to talk about.
Yeah, we'll talk about the what ifs.
Yeah, we'll talk about why.
Again, just because I'm trying to keep up with there's some really good questions coming in. Scott just asked about how we're going to cover it up. I think you've just covered that. Another question from Ice Coffee 13 is: did the Germans analyze what the British and Commonwealth forces did, and how much intelligence did the Germans get from it themselves? Yeah, interesting question. I saw a rabbit hole potentially, but
no. I understand. It's a good question. Now, they did capture some of the operational orders. They didn't capture the specific commando orders, but one of the brigades did bring a set of orders. And if you've ever seen the set of orders for the Dieppe operation, they're about 132 pages of orders. And that is one of the big problems with the operation, was that it was so complex that you had to run the security risk of actually bringing the playbook onto the field with you. In other words, imagine like in an American football game where you actually have your playbook in the huddle. Okay.
Yeah, I was going to make that point at some point. And there's so many contingencies, there's so many elements. It's that there's so many things therefore that can go wrong.
Exactly.
As well. The simpler the plan, in essence, the more likely it is to succeed. This has all these contingencies to allow it to be successful, but in the same way, in a paradoxical way, they're making it more complicated to execute.
It is. The problem is they've created a beast that requires all these contingencies.
Yeah.
But I mean, I guess you can argue on the positive side that they're thinking about contingencies, but at the same time, you cannot get away from the stinging indictment. I think it was leveled by Andrew Cunningham, that basically they're enthusiastic amateurs. They really are at combined operations. And you can see this kind of hubris that has built up because all the other operations have been successes with very little, if any, casualties. And so as a result, there's a mounting hubris. There's a victory disease. There is an arrogance that is developing. They are cutting corners on the planning. They know what they want, and they basically have their eye on the prize, not on what it takes to get the prize. They all want to win the championship, but they don't care about, or I should say they don't care. They don't necessarily have the focus on winning all the individual games in the playoff series to get you to.
Yeah, and I think to give a bit of context as well, because you hinted at it early on about the binding of the hands of the Germans on the boat there, there, is that this is an interesting period in 42 because a month later you have Operation Aquatint, and normally that goes badly wrong. You'd had the raids earlier than that with Anders Lassen into the Channel Islands, where some things go a little bit wrong on that. So there's a little period where our earlier commando raids had been generally going quite well. Then there's like a sticky bit August, September. Then the Germans set about with the commando order, and so there's a really interesting period there going on as well. You can kind of chart these peaks and troughs, if you like, but we can only do that with the benefit of hindsight. When you're in the middle of it, you would never have seen these trends, because Operation Aquatint would be planned completely separately by the small-scale raiding force to this. There'd have been no connection, but now we can look at the kind of calendar and go, that's interesting, that's happening just before that, and that's leading to that, and that's what makes it so thoroughly fascinating.
Well, it's fascinating you bring that up, because you see the same thing with the Pinch Doctrine. In other words, you see the developing Pinch Doctrine in 1940, 41, and 42, and then after Dieppe, it seems to stop. In other words, they realized, I believe, that they bit off way more than they could chew in this one. that, all the realities of, coming across the channel and hitting Hitler's Atlantic wall and having a complex and complicated plan to try to achieve this was probably more than they necessarily wanted. So from what I can see, any of the other pinch operations that were pulled off after, now, mind you, they've already solved the four rotor by early 43. So basically anything that they're trying to go after in 43, 44, and 45 is more to pad and support and continue to feed the beast, as opposed
it's
to
bonus rather than priority, isn't it? It's
right?
And remind me which month they got the Enigma machine off the that was.
Well, in October, they don't really get the machine. What they do is they get some of the ancillary material that they would have been able to get at Dieppe. They get that, and then they're able to find a backdoor way to keep everything ambulatory until May of 43. And then by the summer of 43, you suddenly have the 4 rotor bombs that are under construction. Now they come in, they can tackle the problem, and there's never really any setback. So basically, by the summer of 1943, you are in comfortably, if you will, or as comfortably as possible to reading the 4 rotor. But a Band-Aid solution is what presents itself when a pinch by chance, a submarine is sunk in the Mediterranean, and they end up pinching material off that, which then allows the code breakers at Bletchley to create a Band-Aid solution for a few months.
Another question from Scott Grimwood again, which I'm going to word slightly differently to how he worded it because, hey, it's my show and I want to. But it's during all the planning in your Rudder 2, Jubilee, and I called it Dynamo at the beginning of the show. I realized I had a brain fart earlier. Yeah, it's whatever. Anyway, it's code names and my brain. Anyway, was there updated intelligence coming through from Dieppe? Had, for example, a new German unit moved in, had a new German infantry unit or something, was there a point where they'd have called it off and said, yeah, there's too many there?
Certainly, I think they would have, simply because they had already augmented. One of the reasons why they augmented Dieppe or I should say Rudder turned into Rudder 2 and then to Jubilee, was because they realized that a 15-hour window of opportunity was far too much to give the Germans to react.
Yeah.
I mean, that was what they were worried about. At first, they didn't think so. But then watching the various dispositions, and the good part about it is you still had access to 3-rotor naval ultra and, of course, to the air and army ultra. You were able to keep your finger on the pulse of what the Germans were doing in the area. So even though there was nothing to suggest that the Germans had caught on and they were reinforcing Dieppe particularly, there were enough moves in a very general way over the the preceding months that they were more than comfortable to scale this down to all essential features. And part of that, of course, was going on a 1-tide cycle as opposed to a 2-tide cycle, making it a 6-hour, not a 15-hour operation, because they were afraid that 15 was going to give the Germans too much time to counterattack.
Yeah, and you've only got to look on a map of France and just see how Dieppe is a little bit closer to other places than, for example, Normandy is. There's Amiens, and there's the ports north, and there's the ports south. Who knows what German units might have been within a few hours driving time of there that could have come in. So yeah, I mean, if we had done something in Normandy, if there'd been a pinch raid into Normandy, Cherbourg, we know there'd have been fuck all anywhere near Cherbourg the Germans could have brought up. We knew the disposition, but Dieppe, you're much closer to potentially something.
But also remember the size of Dieppe. It's not Cherbourg, it's not Boulogne, it's not Le Havre, it's not Calais. They're massive.
Yeah.
Whereas Dieppe is bite size.
Yeah.
You can do this, with the forces that you have.
You can see why they're attracted by it. All the ships, the naval headquarters, not so, as you say, it's a small enough harbour or port to kind of consider. There's no way that have attempted it somewhere like Le Havre. It's just too big. I like the fact you emphasise this Saint-Nazaire connection, not just the Red Rider connection, but just the similarity. And we had the discussion in the first show that maybe there was an element to the Saint-Nazaire raid that was beyond just blowing up the dry dock there. That is another whole can of worms, rabbit hole we could go down in the future. I might get Robert Lyman on about that because he wrote a cracking book about Saint-Nazaire.
It just seems to be common sense. I mean, if you're going to put on a raid at a U-boat base, you're obviously going to be looking for something as well.
Well, I think we're gonna sort of bring it to an end fairly soon, but just Terry just asked. I mean, it's all in the book, but you went through a shitload of documents to back all this up. I mean, just countless boxes and archives. And interesting, even in between your editions of your book, more stuff had become available to you that gave you that extra amount of stuff. So, I mean, to list all the documents and archival sources you went through now would take another half an hour, wouldn't it? So,
it'd take a series of shows.
Basically, a lot of documentation, and that's. We discussed it in the first show. For those who haven't seen the first show, we did go through that. Well, I say we. David went through that thing of saying that some of the previous Canadian historians, so the earlier generation, had, without realizing it, got nearly close to this same conclusion. But the archival information, the documents hadn't been released, Ultra and all the other stuff. And had they had access to that, David could have been beaten by 20 years, quite possibly.
Well, yeah, I mean, I never look at it in that sense of could have been beaten, but
you know what I mean. But they
would have had the truth 20 years earlier. But I think that's a more appropriate way to put it. And I mean, I look out. I mean, the people who did some great work, 25 years ago. You have Brian Villa and John Campbell, Peter Henshaw, Hugh Henry. Hugh got really close to this. Without a doubt, even Robin Nealons, like I told you about, the late Robin Nealons, sadly, he was like a blind dog in a meat house. He could smell it, couldn't find it. He understood that the Royal Marines were the key, but he didn't understand why or what, but he knew it. He said, just by analyzing the operation, he realized that there had to be more of a reason than for the Royal Marines being there than somebody just dreamed this up.
Yeah.
And that's, and going through, 150,000 plus pages of material, X amount of years, I don't know how many documents, but it's 300 gigs plus of material. That I have. I mean,
there's a staggering amount about it. And again, I think just the fact there's so much there is because it was just more than just going in and blowing stuff up. And I'm using that very simplistic analogy because I like it. But, some of the earlier Commando stuff, there wouldn't have been much paperwork because it was like, take a boat over, go and blow things up, come back home again. Why would there be a need to create a massive, great archive if it's something so simplistic as that? This has these so many elements of and so many moving parts, and the launch coming to take stuff away. Hence, therefore, with all the people who needed to know their role in the operation and all the timing issues, and all the tri-service Commando, Royal Marine Commando, Army, you need that amount of paperwork to square it all away and make sense of it. So therefore, that's why there were so many documents, because it was a complicated operation beyond the conceived narrative we all kind of grew up believing.
It is. It's interesting, and again, to touch on what I mentioned earlier. The idea that now that we understand that this is, I would argue, the first of modern special operations, we now get the U.S. Marines have reached out to me, the Canadian Army Staff School has reached out to me. They're all fascinated by this. And not just from a historical perspective, they're fascinated by a war studies perspective. In other words, my God, now we understand what Dieppe was all about. Let's take a serious look at it. And let's figure out that, if we were to put on these kind of operations today, and I guess in some cases, these operations are probably a little more modern than perhaps we'd like to admit, that, they want to learn genuine lessons from Dieppe as opposed to, the package of all the other stuff that we've heard for so long.
We covered in the first one. We've been trying to find a reason for Dieppe that was, we were inventing reasons for it that were getting very complicated, and Stalin and all this other stuff there that we were just not seeing. Well, with this truth in front of us. And now, as you say, the fact we can actually study what it really was about opens up the door to much more investigation of how we were developing special forces and how we were incorporating techniques, as you say, we are now using in commonplace. Even 2 years later by D-Day, things are getting better in terms of how the 30 AU have a pretty, not easy, but things go very well for them in Normandy. They share their Utah landings and their Gold Beach landings. They've got experts with them, and they've learned how not to do things. So anyway, we can going round and round.
Yeah. I mean, the idea really is, at the end of the day, it's not about getting a commando unit, a small commando unit, to a target. It's about affecting a pinch. And the Pinch was in right from the start. And the Pinch was part of a policy that was developing for years with the British government, or with the British forces. So that's really the takeaway in all this, that even when they bring in the Army commandos on the flanks, they're Pinch veterans of the Lofoten raid.
Yeah.
The Lofoten raids, both of them. So, you're going there, as Churchill said, a reconnaissance in force. And it really is, for the most part, even though that was just something he pulled out of his butt. I'll
tell you something, I'm finding that this last year of doing this stuff for World War II TV, I was always a 1944 guy because I live in Normandy and do D-Day tours. I'm actually beginning to find 1942 really interesting because it's a very transitional year between losing things everywhere to winning things everywhere. And I mean, it's a very simplistic way again of saying it, but there's lots of fascinating stuff about 42. With these commando raids and special forces raids and Bruneval and freshmen and all these things like that I'm finding it really, really interesting. And then 43 kind of goes off the boil a bit in that sense because it's Sicily. Anyway, but I'm finding 42 really fascinating, and I'm really looking forward to next year, because next year, of course, will be the 80th anniversary of 1942. So I'd already planned to do something about Bruneval this year, but I'm actually postponing it partly because of lockdown and COVID, and I want to go big on Operation Biting next year for the 80th. Sure. And I want to go big on Aquatint. I want to go big on Saint-Nazaire and all those things, because I'm looking 41. 2021, 41. There's some good anniversaries this year, but next year, I'm really looking forward to next year.
Well, it is. When I started working on this, I never realized just how poorly documented and poorly understood 1942 was.
Yeah.
In the historiography, which is interesting. And if
we're always using it as a stepping stone to later, aren't we? It becomes a little bit, it's Dunkirk, 1939, 1940, phony war, then it's learning, 44. And it's like, no, backpedal, expand that middle bit. It's like, have you ever been to the Cabinet War Rooms in London, the new Churchill thing, that table, that big, like 20 long foot table, where it's got every date of Churchill's life on that virtual thing. And you can, with your like touch screen, you can open up every year. 42 to me is like this kind of never-ending, like Russian dolls of interest. The more I look in it, the more different levels of stuff there is, and I'm just finding it really, really cool now. 42.
Yeah, and I think you and I talked about it. There's really two 1942s. There's the first half and the second half.
Yeah.
The second half is the turning point, right? You've got El Alameins and Stalingrads, etc., and Midway. I guess Midway would be the one, but the first 6 months of 1942 are as precarious as any other moment of the war, even though the Americans are in, because they don't have control of the sea lanes at that point to be able to maximize their potential.
Yeah.
We were talking off air before, it's, businesses in their first year go out of business because of cash flow, issues with cash flow. And if you can't get, your goods to market, you're going to die, and that's what we see in
that's very important.
42.
So to round things off, I mean, we just had a couple of people asked about other books about Dieppe, and I mean, I'm sure you can give us a couple of titles, just generally about 1942 and the evolution of things. I really want to recommend Alan Allport's last book, which I've just completely forgotten the title of now, but I had him on a show. Go back through YouTube. I'll put the link in later on, but that. And it's just it won't come back to my brain now.
It's not the one just called 1942, is it?
No, it's about the oh god, I'm embarrassed when those things happen. But his last book, I did a show about it with it. It's just sad. I mean, it's a crackingly good book about it's the British at war, Britain at Bay. There we go. Bay. Okay. It's just a really good book. It's social history, cultural history, military history, political history. Alan just tweeted a couple of days ago some review he got from a really, really good thing. So this is like the best political study of the mid-war period I've ever read, and it's immensely readable, because when you read politics, cultural, you think, oh my god, it is immensely readable. His Lord of the Rings Shires analogy at the beginning of the book about the Shire folk of England is worth getting the book just for that small chapter. I love that. That bit. I'm a big fanboy of Alan Allport, and I had him on my Star Wars show talking about AT-ATs and so anyway, whatever. But give us a couple of book titles that are more about the other side of the Dieppe raid, for the people watching.
Well, I would go back and I would certainly take a look at Brian Villa's Unauthorized Action. John Campbell, Dieppe Revisited. And oh boy, then there's a whole bunch. I mean, you can go back for some really amazing first-person testimonial in Terrence, I think it's Terrence Robertson's Shame and the Glory. And I would argue that even, you know, the year that my book came out, I would say the last comprehensive account of our old understanding is Mark Zulke's Tragedy at Dieppe. I mean, I always think that's a really good 1-2 punch. You know, Mark will take you up to where the new research starts, basically. And then,
it's a thorough examination of the whole infantry element, company by company, battalion, and it takes you through all that stage there, which your book does covers, but it's not the primary focus of your book because it's not the aim. So I think, to me, that'd be a very good set to read. You know, one by that. It's like watching Dunkirk and The Darkest Hour at the same time, going through scene after scene. They kind of give you
that's not a bad way of doing it. Yeah, that's a pretty good way of doing it. I would suggest.
I'm going to do an editor's mix of that. I'm going to do an editor's cut where I cut from Dunkirk to Darkest Hour back again. I'm going to do that one day. Make millions. Yeah. Good. I think we'll leave it there, David. I can't wait to come back, and in whatever shape or form we will do the third program, and it will depend, folks, on how things go with lockdowns and COVID and vaccines. We've got curfews and travel restrictions here, so I don't know when that'll happen, but it will happen at some point. In terms of what we've got coming up, I haven't actually listed it on YouTube yet, but I'm scheduling in a new show Wednesday evening because I found I had a 4-day gap and I didn't want to have any time off. So I've got Steve Darlow coming on talking about the bomber command role in getting rid of V1 flying bombers. It'll be interesting. And then it all kicks off again at the end of the week with lots more shows. I can't even list them all coming up. We've got lots of stuff coming up. But yeah, anyway, don't forget to click subscribe. Check us out on Patreon. Join up with us so you get more information. Follow me on Twitter. Follow David on Twitter. Check out our websites. Check out everything, and you'll find out more of this. But David, it's been an absolute pleasure. I've learned again, even though I read the book, I've learned more again of it tonight. People have really enjoyed it. More will find it on Catch Up later on. Right. And we will join you again for part 3 whenever the hell that happens. So
fingers crossed. Looking forward to it. Can't wait to get on site.
We will do that. So thank you very much for watching, everybody. We'll see you all again Wednesday evening. I haven't advertised it yet, but it'll be there soon. Steve Darlow, Bomber Command, V1s. Thank you for watching. This is Paul and David saying see you all again very soon.